We have Natalie Diesel. Natalie began working for the Missouri Department of Conservation in 2017. As forest pathologist, Natalie's work focuses on insect and disease diagnostics, invasive forest pest surveys, training and management recommendations for foresters and the public, and invasive forest pest outreach. Natalie earned her BS in biology at the University of Missouri before pursuing her MS in entomology at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, where she studied chemical ecology of the wood-boring longhorned beetles. I'll turn it over to you, Natalie. Thank you so much.
So like Lori said, my name is Natalie Diesel. I'm the forest pathologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. Today I'm going to provide a few updates on various forest pests in Missouri, but I wanted to start off real quick and talk a little bit about some weather issues we've experienced in the last year. Depending on where you are in the state, you might remember we had a late spring frost in mid-April. In some parts of the state, it was probably a little bit more noticeable. We were down in the Eminence area in early May, I believe, and we could definitely see the damage where trees had started to leaf out and then had been hit with that frost. In other parts of the state, like up here where I'm at in central Missouri, the damage wasn't quite as noticeable, but there had been damage to buds. And so we saw some plants with leaves that looked like they maybe had herbicide damage, somewhat misshapen leaves, or even some dieback due to that frost. So keep these weather events in mind, keep an eye on weather events. And if you have plants that you think may have been affected, don't give up on them. Sorry about that. This is the most recent drought monitor map from last week. You can see parts of the state are getting pretty dry here, especially down in the Southwest. We've got some areas with extreme drought. Another map showing drought right now this is a precipitation departure from normal map for June through August for that several month period. And you can see down in the Southwest and up in the Northeast, we're getting pretty dry. And it's interesting, if you compare this map to a year-long map from September through August, you can see just how far ahead we actually are in some areas, particularly down there in the South. And so when you think about how far ahead we are for the year, but then how far behind we are for the last 3 months, it's kind of interesting that despite all that rain or all that dryness down there, we're actually still so far ahead. So that means that we got quite a bit of water earlier in the year down there. And so I wanted to brush up real quick on rain and root rot. When we get these really large rainfall events where you're getting several inches in a short period of time, that actually eliminates oxygen from the soil, and roots need oxygen. And so that's actually pretty damaging to roots, especially species that aren't well adapted to that type of environment. So damaged roots are going to be much more susceptible to certain root rot pathogens. And you can get what we call the cut flower effect, where you've got these roots that are damaged by rainfall events, and then you got root rot pathogens that come in and nibble on the roots. And then if the conditions swing from overly wet to overly dry, you can actually get those roots not pulling up enough moisture and the trees may crash. So again, that's kind of like the cut flower when the vase dries up. Or you can get these damaged roots that cause trees to decline for years after that point. So if you're seeing trees declining on your property, don't forget to consider these environmental events, armillaria, root rots. It was a big year for armillaria this year. We saw quite a few trees later in the summer that were showing symptoms, but then also we saw actual signs of armillaria. You can see these honey mushrooms here. We saw quite a few honey mushrooms throughout the state. These clusters of brown mushrooms are pretty distinct, but they're not always the best diagnostic tool because they're only there for a short amount of time and they're only going to show up when conditions are just right. So if you have plants trees you suspect might be suffering from armillaria, there's also destructive sampling, which is where you actually remove the bark from the root flare using a hatchet or a mattock. and you look for this dense white fungal material, these fungal mats. So this was on a sassafras this fall. You can see just how much fungal material there was under the bark there. So if you have trees that are declining and you're willing to destructive sample on them, this is one way to look for armillaria. Most of our forest health fact sheets and information can be found on the MDC website. We did make this identifying and diagnosing armillaria page this fall just because we were seeing so much armillaria. And this is not available on the website. If this is something you think you would like, I can either give it to Lori to distribute, or you can email me directly and we'd be happy to send that to you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about herbicide injury. There's sort of a couple sides to herbicide injury, but we've noticed here in the Forest Health Program in the last few years that once you start learning about herbicide injury and looking for it, it's much more common than you would think, and it's troubling. So the first side of herbicide injury is going to be the ag herbicides. So these are some of those big names that you've heard of probably in recent years. If you live within a couple miles of ag, if you live near ag, you need to be aware of this and kind of learn about this and kind of learn to recognize it. The damage, the symptoms is going to vary really widely depending on when the tree was exposed, how much chemical it was exposed to, was it exposed once or several times throughout the season? What kind of tree is it? What state was it in to begin with? How healthy was it? We found in Missouri, it seems like the most sensitive species are oaks, sycamores, redbud. And what to look for, symptoms usually show up about 21 days after exposure. We note a lot of cupped, twisted, kind of elongated strap-like leaves. And symptoms can be kind of patchy throughout the canopy. They might be just in the upper canopy or in the lower canopy. And you might only see injury on either the newer growth or the older growth. It just depends on when that tree was exposed. So this is 2,4-D injury in Illinois, confirmed 2,4-D injury. And you can see it's pretty severe. That's that cup-like, it's called cobra head injury. And we're starting to wonder in Illinois, they think actually that this is killing trees, or it's at least kicking off decline. So we're not exactly sure what's going to happen to these trees, but we've seen this type of damage in Missouri and we're monitoring it. So there's the agricultural herbicides, and then there's also the other side of it, which is the landowner herbicides, the ones that are a great tool in your toolbox and are definitely necessary as a land manager, but can also cause problems. So glyphosate, you know, a really important herbicide, but can also cause long-term injury in some cases. Glyphosate products containing glyphosate sometimes contain surfactants that can increase absorption of glyphosate. In plants that are exposed, you might have reduced cold hardiness, especially in younger plants, smaller, more thin-barked trees, that can result in bark cracks, which then you can get wood decay going. We've seen this quite a bit, particularly in yard trees. Kind of the interesting thing about glyphosate is that it can actually take a couple years after exposure to begin to show symptoms. It can take 2 or more years to actually show itself in the plant, depending on how large it is. And then you can also get carryover for several years after that point. So what that means is once the tree begins to exhibit symptoms, it might continue to exhibit those symptoms for several years. The glyphosate kind of sticks around inside the plant, inside that tree. A little bit more about glyphosate. It's the most widely used herbicide in the world. There's hundreds of products out there containing glyphosate. Kind of a little bit of quick history. In 2000, the Monsanto's patent expired. And since that point, many, many products have come onto the market, many containing additional chemicals, surfactants, in order to increase uptake and be faster acting, so that weed kill is killed a lot faster and doesn't take 3 days, it takes 1 day, or, you know. So a Roundup does break down quickly in the soil, but like I said previously, not necessarily in a tree. So here's that damage I was talking about. You can see on the left a tree that had some sprouts pruned off, glyphosate got in and caused this bark split. We've seen this on trees in yards and even at our own office, actually. And then on the right, you can see the kind of typical glyphosate damage, that proliferation of buds. And you can see that oftentimes for several years after a plant's been exposed. So as a land manager, again, not trying to bash on herbicide. I know it is an important tool, but just be sure to be applying it with care, reading the labels, and choosing products appropriate for the situation. You want to choose products that don't have an adjuvant load, and you do not want to add any ammonium sulfate if you're using glyphosate around trees. Okay, so switching over now to the insect and disease issues. Emerald ash borer, I think everybody's familiar with this pest. You can see here all of the green counties are ones where we've confirmed emerald ash borer. At this point, it can be considered essentially statewide. There's still a few counties on there that need to be confirmed, but emerald ash borer is essentially in all of Missouri's counties. So if you have ash in your forest and you live in a county that hasn't completely had a EAB event, insecticides are not going to be practical for your forest trees. Research has shown that there's nothing you can do management-wise to kind of EAB proof your stands. If you don't have ash regeneration, if you don't have seedlings, ash is just going to disappear from your forests. But on the other hand, if you do have a lot of ash seedlings coming up, you can't really rely on emerald ash borer to kill these trees for you. You're going to have to go ahead and manage those. Emerald ash borer is going to only hit trees that are about 8 to 10 inches in diameter and larger. And then do keep in mind as you're out there working that infested trees are very brittle and very hazardous. So your options, you can either harvest trees before they're killed. If they're, again, if they're over 10 inches in diameter, they're going to be killed. Or you can do nothing and hope for, potential resistance, hope for lingering ash trees, although it'll be very, very unlikely. So oak wilt, hopefully most of you are familiar with oak wilt. This is one of the most serious diseases of oaks, particularly oaks in the red oak group in the eastern United States. So what we see with oak wilt, infected trees, red oaks will wilt in midsummer, kind of flash fry, and then drop leaves rapidly, as you can see here. Just a quick thing to mention, there is overland transmission of oak wilt by small sap beetles that pick up spores from killed trees and carry them to fresh wounds. And then there's also the underground transmission of oak wilt, where you'll have an infected tree that can infect its neighbors through root grafts. So the general rule of thumb that we tell the public is don't prune mid-March through June to protect oaks from oak wilt. Really, the better recommendation is just don't prune during the growing season. It's not the proper time to be pruning anyway. So if at all possible, don't prune during the growing season. If for some reason you do need to prune, go ahead and use a wound dressing spray, or you can use asphalt-free latex paint to cover wounds. That would be to prevent the beetles from coming to those wounds and bringing in the oak wilt spores. But this is the only time we would recommend doing this. Quick update on thousand cankers disease of black walnut. If any of you are walnut growers, you're probably very familiar with thousand cankers disease. This is going to be the walnut twig beetle, a very, very small bark beetle that tunnels underneath the bark. And then the fungus it brings with it creates dark cankers around beetle tunnels. So in the eastern United States, some good news. In recent years, we've seen tree improvement actually in areas where TCD, thousand cankers disease, has been introduced. And even in some of these areas, they're actually having a difficult time redetecting walnut twig beetle. When thousand cankers disease first kind of came to be in the eastern states, especially in Tennessee, They were in a pretty severe drought at that time. And since coming out of that drought, these trees have improved, and walnut twig beetle seems to be much more difficult to find. And so we're thinking that thousand cankers disease is going to be really an issue primarily for stressed black walnut. So that's the good news. And then we've also had some kind of interestingly, we've had detections of the fungus that walnut twig beetle carries, Geosmithia morbida, on other insects, non-walnut twig beetle, and in the absence of walnut twig beetle. So real quick, here's that tree improvement I mentioned. On the left, you can see this tree in Tennessee back in 2010. Again, that was during a very severe drought. And then you can see on the right, the same tree 3 years later, looking much better after having some deadwooding. And then I mentioned several eastern states, including Missouri, have found the Geosmithia morbida, the fungus associated with thousand cankers disease. So we do not have thousand cankers disease. We haven't found the beetle, but we do have the fungus. We found it on some other insects. And so we're thinking the fungus is possibly native, it's widespread, and is not going to be causing problems in the absence of walnut twig beetle. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of pests to be on the lookout for, starting with the spotted lanternfly. You may have heard about this pest. It's a fairly new one. It was introduced to Pennsylvania several years ago and is starting to spread from there. It is a very striking and pretty recognizable pest. So you can see there on the top left, that's the adult with its wings closed. Below that is a mature nymph. And then on the right there, you can see a couple of egg masses where the eggs are laid and then a kind of a waxy coating is put over them. They look like a little spot of mud. So this is a hitchhiking pest, kind of like gypsy moth. They lay their egg masses on landscaping material, outdoor furniture, cars, etc. And so this is one that could show up really anywhere in Missouri at just about any time now. It's going to be an agricultural pest. It feeds on, its preferred host is tree of heaven, but it also feeds on lots of our native trees. It feeds on grapes, orchard fruits, hops. It's going to be an agricultural and potentially a forest pest. So you can see all the clusters of the immatures and then the adults all feeding there. Asian longhorn beetle, this is another pretty famous forest pest in the eastern US. We've never detected it in Missouri, but it is one that we want people to be on the lookout for. There's the adult, long antennae, black body with white spots. It's a pretty sizable beetle. It loves red maple. Its preferred host is red maple, but it also feeds on about 20 other trees. And so this is one that we definitely need to find. If it's here, we need to find it as fast as possible. You can look for these large round exit holes in the bark. And again, especially on maples. So if you see this, call us ASAP. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention laurel wilt. This is one that's becoming increasingly concerning. It has been detected in Western Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a lethal wilt disease that's spread by a small ambrosia beetle. And it causes, kind of like oak wilt, it causes sassafras to rapidly wilt and can also move through root grafts. So you might have an entire clump of sassafras that will wilt. What to look for, aside from the wilting tree, look for small, very small exit holes and these sawdust toothpicks that the beetles kind of kick out of their exit holes. So with that, I'll just go ahead and say, you know, new pests can arrive at any time. We don't get a warning right before we get a new pest. So be on the lookout, you know your trees and what the common issues they get are. And if you're seeing anything abnormal, go ahead and report that. Better safe than sorry. And go ahead and report, you know, unusual insects to our Forest Health email account, forest.health@mdc.mo.gov. And with that, I'll take any questions if we still have time. And if not, you can email me directly.
Thank you so much, Natalie.
Yeah.
We do have Few questions.
Sure.
So what species are most susceptible to root drowning, or does it matter?
We see, I think you're going to probably, the best answer would probably be trees that aren't necessarily flood adapted. So we saw quite a bit of armillaria this year on white oaks, on post oak, sassafras. Trees that are flood adapted are going to be a little bit better at handling that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay. And causes of rapid white oak mortality.
Yeah, so we haven't had much recent developments as far as research on rapid white oak mortality goes. There's still a lot of unanswered questions there, unfortunately. We had a project at MU looking at that that kind of wrapped up. And at this point, the best we can say is a combination of environmental conditions and potentially an exotic root rot pathogen. But we think that some kind of extreme weather events lined up and kind of the stars aligned. We've had a late freeze in 2007, followed by some drought and some also alternately some really extreme rainfall. And we think there was kind of this kind of special lineup of conditions that caused root damage and stressed out trees. But at this point, we don't have an answer, a firm answer, a smoking gun. But we do hope that maybe we can get some more research going.
Okay, this one's kind of lengthy, so bear with me. Can you discuss how a forest plan works? Is it like a USDA CRP plan where there is a payment and the landowner has an obligation to complete the plan? This may not be for you. This may be in regards to the video. So if it's not, we'll come back to it later.
Yeah, that's not really one that I'm prepared to answer.
Yeah, as I'm reading into it more. Yeah, okay, so this one is for you. If we clear a tree and apply a herbicide like RTU, Tordon, or full strength Roundup, can this application injure nearby trees through the roots or other means?
Yep, yeah, that is true. I don't have a ton of background on this, but my understanding is that certainly can happen. It can move through roots, through grafted roots, or even potentially into the soil to nearby roots. So yes.
Okay. And it looks like there's just one last question. It says, low Japanese beetles this summer. What would you predict in future years?
That's going to kind of depend on where you are in the state and what the kind of weather conditions are year to year. Drought in late summer has been kind of in August, late July has been associated with lower Japanese beetle numbers. And so if you're in an area that's real dry that time of year, you'll probably have lower numbers the next year. And then also, once Japanese beetle's been in an area for a while, about 15 years or so, some of the natural controls start to catch up with it, and you tend to see kind of more moderate numbers. And so really the highest numbers are probably going to be in areas where Japanese beetle hasn't been around that long.
All right. It looks like that's all the questions we have. If any should pop up, I'll pass them along to you. Thank you, Ben, Natalie. We appreciate you being here with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much.